There were times where I just almost gave up. I was like, I just can't do it. And I was feeling desperation.
Welcome to The Quiet Tension. I'm your host, Dr. Sharon Chirban. In this show, we explore what's happening beneath high performance, the part that drives us, shapes us, and pulls at us too. Through conversations with leaders, athletes, and creatives, we push past the surface and into what it really takes to operate at this level. Today, we're talking with restaurateur and Master Sommelier Dennis Kelly. Dennis is the co-owner of Protege, a Michelin-starred restaurant in Palo Alto, California. But his path to mastery was anything but straightforward. Before wine, there was wrestling, architecture, and music, and years of uncertainty about where he belonged. And that's part of what makes Dennis so interesting. His story doesn't follow the shape we often expect from high performers. There wasn't one obvious path, one early declaration of ambition, or one clear identity he was always moving toward. We expect success to have a look, a straight line, a certain swagger, especially coming out of the French Laundry, a Michelin-starred restaurant. Dennis Kelly has none of the swagger, but all of the success. So I wanted to start with the contradiction at the center of him. He's one of the most accomplished people in the wine world, and yet Dennis does not consider himself a high performer.
I mean, there were always people that I looked up to that clearly were outperforming me, and often by a country mile. And I was just never one of those people, whether it was athletics or, in education, whatever it was that I was pursuing in that moment. I always looked up to others who I just thought were outperforming me.
And that might be something we come back to when we establish just where you are now relative to even, say, wine peers or relative to restaurant owners. We could still re-examine what high performance means in that environment. You said that you didn't follow a traditional path, potentially learning being it's very unique for you. So you started with architecture, moved to music. You were trying to figure things out. What was off about those environments at the time?
I didn't really know. No, I honestly just struggled. Education was something that I struggled with my entire life. I was never a good student. I never had good attention. I was always easily distracted. My mom used to tell me if my head wasn't attached, I would lose it. And she was probably right. And that's just kind of how life was. And I never thought of, any alternatives. I feel very fortunate about the way things worked out because there were many points in my life where I was just thinking, what am I going to do with my life? Am I going to be a loser? Or, I honestly didn't know what I was going to do as a profession. And I pivoted numerous times, as you mentioned. I went to college on an athletic scholarship and, again, wasn't a state champion, went to a high school that had, 2, 3, even 4-time state champions, and I was never a state champion. So I was an underperformer in certain ways from day one, athletically. As I was finishing up my associate's art degree, which I never actually completed after 2 years, I decided to pivot. And I was getting into music, and I had played drums when I was younger and bought myself a kit and fell in love with the idea of being a professional musician and discovered this school in California called the Musicians Institute. I decided to move to Hollywood, attend this school, and then get into bands, which I did. And, at some point, after starving and babysitting band members for long enough, I decided to pivot into the only other thing that I knew, which was hospitality. And I always really enjoyed bartending. As I decided to view that as a career, I decided I really needed to move more towards restaurants than bars, which is what I had worked in to that point. And I was really curious about it. Ended up with a little independent in Oregon and somehow convinced them that based on my bar managing experience that I might be a good general manager and a lot of responsibility that was not initially intended for me fell on my plate, including the wine list, which I knew nothing about.
Mm.
And I didn't change the wine list for months. So even though it was in my control, and vendors, distributors were coming up to me going, hey, you've been in charge of the wine list for 6 months and you haven't changed a single thing. Would you like to maybe have a tasting and I can kind of guide you? It was very obvious to them that I was completely unqualified for that role. And that was sort of the first time I got an interest in wine. Didn't really start studying or anything like that, but it was at least something that made me curious. And then eventually I moved to the Napa Valley, and that's where things really took off.
So in Oregon, you were working in that general manager role. The wine list got into your hands, but you really weren't skilled yet to make any actual decisions. Can you tell us how Napa got on your map? Like what made you think about Napa and then, of course, the French Laundry? How did that transition happen?
So we moved to Napa in hopes of getting a position at the French Laundry. They had shut down the French Laundry to take that team to New York to sort of inoculate the French Laundry culture in per se, which was like the French Laundry per se. And I realized, hey, they'll probably be hiring when they reopen. I got there before they reopened. And frankly, I knew my resume wasn't necessarily all it needed to be. So I applied at some other places, got a position at a place called Martini House in St. Helena, where I worked for just over a year as a floor manager. Learned a lot. And one of the gentlemen that I was working with, he was a captain at Martini House, was a foods runner at the French Laundry, a kitchen server. And he said, hey, they're hiring a captain, and I think he'd be really well suited. And, I could get you an interview if you're interested. And I was like, that would be amazing. And so thankfully I got the interview, I got the position, and, that was a huge catalyst for me, a huge break.
You did commit to Napa with the hope in mind of getting hired there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you took the one position to sort of set yourself up. I think that's a repeating theme that we may come back to, because I think you did the same thing with Anthony Seckvier. Mm-hmm. You kind of get your eyes set on something, and then you sort of patiently wait it out or figure out what you need to do.
Yeah, I definitely was in for the long play, so to speak. I also realized early on, and I mentioned that I was thinking about going to Cleveland to start a place. I realized that if I'm going to make hospitality my career, I really want to be an owner. And so everything that I did from that point really was geared towards and directed to ownership, and educating myself. I mean, I literally, when I got here to, the Bay Area, I went to De Anza College and I took all the business law classes I could take and all the accounting classes. Because again, I was preparing myself for ownership. And honestly, I'm not even sure what I took away from those classes. I took them as far as I could without being a law student or a business student and pursuing a degree. But, I'm not even sure. Honestly, I look at a balance sheet. I'm like, what is a balance sheet? Like, I've never been really good at learning. And I think that was one of the reasons that I was able to pass the Master Sommelier examination, is because I got to create my own curriculum. The Court of Master Sommeliers is a testing body. There is certainly a teaching component to it, but to climb your way up the ladder, you have to pass examinations and you essentially create your own curriculum. And that was a huge advantage for me. And really the first time that I was being judged on something that I created the process behind. I created my own notes. I was reading through books and I created a curriculum that made sense to me. And I didn't realize until later how unusual my approach was, until I tried sharing it with other people and they would look at me like I had three eyes and they'd be like, okay. And I'm thinking, hey, I've got the answer book right here. Like it worked for me. If it could work for me, it could work for anyone. So I was very, enthusiastic about sharing my approach. And I did realize, and it's not that I'm not enthusiastic about teaching anymore, but I did realize that my approach may be a bit unusual.
So we're all offered a deal early in life: follow the path, success will follow. And some people don't find themselves successful following the path and instead get this quiet message that something must be wrong with me. Possibly I'm a loser. There were two researchers at Harvard who studied this phenomena, O.G. Ogus and Todd Rose. They followed these people and they called them dark horses. What they discovered is that this group of successful people pursued fulfillment first, and excellence followed. Curiosity combined with their own particular learning style led them to unforeseen pathways of success. Dennis is almost an archetype of the dark horse. Until wine and his particular thinking and learning style, we hear him describe himself as a loser, an underperformer in sports, that he never excelled at anything. How long did it take in the pursuit of the Master Sommelier from when you conceived that this is something that I want? It sounds like back in Oregon, you started to get really curious. When did you put your eyes on the prize?
So I was working at Martini House and I was introduced to a Master Sommelier. And honestly, I wasn't even familiar. They were introducing me to a gentleman named Bob Bath, and they were telling me he's a Master Sommelier. I didn't know what a sommelier was. I had never even heard the word at that point in my life. And I'm not kidding. The busboys were very knowledgeable and very interested about wine. And I had almost no exposure to wine at that point. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be the manager, I need to at least be able to carry my own weight. So I did buy a couple of books, and I was enjoying reading them. But yeah, that's how it started. And then you can take one examination per year, pass or fail. After I passed the introductory, in theory, I was preparing for the advanced examination. And that's what I was doing. I was so inspired by the course and Bob Bath and Doug Frost, the two proctors, that I said, that's what I want to be when I grow up. Unfortunately, I was 39 years old at the time. But they were very inspiring, and I continued to learn. And I said, I think I'm going to try to do this. You know, at the time they told you 2 years to prepare for your master exam after the advanced. And in 2008, I was given an opportunity to interview for the head sommelier position at the French Laundry. So what happened was I was learning so much through reading and preparing for these examinations that I started to, there were a couple of results of that were very motivating. One was that I was more comfortable in my home, the restaurant. I'm in Napa. I'm talking to very affluent guests often about wine, and I was woefully under-prepared. I like to tell the story about how one of the sommeliers allowed me to taste a little bit of Roussan, Reynard Roussan. It was the half bottle that was just sitting there unfinished, and they said, hey, you want to taste this wine? I said, yeah, I'd love to. And I tasted this wine, and I was so impressed. And honestly, it was the only wine that I had tasted at the French Laundry at the time, that I started selling it as a captain all the time. I would just recommend it. And I thought everything was fine. And then several months down the road, the sommelier came to me and said, hey, Dennis, we've only repurchased this because it's all you sell. Is there anything else that you can sell? And I said, I didn't know I was supposed to. It's the only wine I know. So that's when I was like, okay, I guess they expect more out of me. And so what I started doing was every time I served a wine, which I knew nothing about, I would go home and research that after service. I'd have a bowl of cereal, get online, go to Domaine Rouleau or, Domaine de Complafon. I'd go to these websites and read, and I started to understand their philosophy and how their philosophy impacted the character of the wine and the terroir. And I found it very fascinating, how the history and what grows together goes together, and how the geology, there's so many things that came to create this unique wine that had a sense of place. And I just found it very fascinating.
So would you say, it sounds like you genuinely were absorbed and engaged. It wasn't just about kind of holding your own at the table side with people who knew more than you.
Yeah.
But you, in fact, developed a deep curiosity and
I did.
true
But
passion.
I was incentivized because one, suddenly my teammates who I felt, when I started, I was so inexperienced. I had really never waited tables. I was a bartender, kind of faked my way into management. And I had never been a server. That was never my dedicated position. And so suddenly I'm serving at the French Laundry, really underprepared. And all your peers know that, right? So I felt not that they were disrespecting me, but I just didn't earn a lot of respect from my peers. So as I started learning about wine and at pre-service meetings, they would ask wine-related questions and I'd be the only one that knew the answer.
There's a moment here you might miss if you don't speak wine. Dennis's head sommelier starts testing him, but testing him on a detail, like the exact sugar levels in Alsace wine. The average server on any restaurant floor doesn't have that information handy. Listen closely.
Sometimes I think that the head sommelier started kind of pushing, because I think about some of the questions he asked, and I think he was just really trying to see what I knew, because he was asking, what's the minimal residual sugar level for Vendange Tardive and Selection Grand Noble in Alsace, And I'm like, well, Muscat and Riesling are this, and Gewürztraminer, and Pinot Gris are that, and the captains are looking at me and going, how do you know this?
That's not a detail that someone who doesn't pay attention holds on to. This was the boy that was told that he'd lose his head if it wasn't attached to his body. Now he's holding one of the most precise pieces of information in one of the tiniest corners of the wine world. That's the moment that Dennis starts to meet his own mind.
I'm thinking, why is Gregory even asking this question? And I think he was really just kind of trying to see what this guy knew, So I was earning respect from my teammates, and that was very gratifying. I also felt like it was earning me respect at the table, because you go into this relationship with these very affluent guests who are on vacation. They're spending a lot of money. They're very successful. They're very knowledgeable about wine. In many cases, a lot of these are very serious collectors. And the relationship didn't necessarily feel eye to eye. And I noticed that as my wine knowledge became stronger, they started to respect me more. I could chime in and give them some specifics, and suddenly they looked at me very differently. And it was also, beneficial in the end, because after they respect you a little more, they leave a little more gratuity in the end. So I was like, this is profitable. Eventually, the head sommelier that I mentioned before started asking for me to work certain tables that were going to be wine, labor intensive. And those were the ones where you were getting the big tips. And if somebody came in and was spending a lot of money on wine, there was a really good chance they were going to leave a really good gratuity. So it was very beneficial in many ways, and it was incentivizing.
So clearly, it reinforced you, financially, professionally, when that internal metrics started to change, where you started to earn respect. Mm-hmm. Can you say how that felt different to you than that kid that had a hard time learning, or if his head wasn't screwed on, he might not know where it was? What was it like for you for that shift to really happen?
It was a real confidence boost for me. I always was very insecure. And I think in some ways that is another motivating factor for me in terms of learning about wine. Was I was going to be forced to speak about it. And I'm not a good BSer. I'm not comfortable, and I worked with people who could sell ice to an Eskimo, and they didn't have to have a lot of knowledge behind it, but they could be very convincing. And that just wasn't me. I wasn't that sales type of person. I really had to be confident in the facts that I was delivering, or I was going to say, I'm honestly not sure. Let me see if I can find out for you. And so, again, to be comfortable in my own house and in the position that I worked 40 hours a week, it was, it just gave me the confidence that made my work far more pleasurable. It just made me more comfortable. So I think a lot of what was motivating to me was overcoming that insecurity.
Mm-hmm. So studying wine, becoming a master at wine is a multi-dimensional task. Like to get competent, there's the storytelling, reading websites, going deep on the details, being motivated by feeling maybe inadequate or a touch insecure. So you compensate for that. You go for more detail. Again, when people get stumped on the tasting and the mastery, like the knowledge piece, you clearly seemed to just, your brain started to click in on the details, like you were holding information. So that residual sugar in Alsace, that's not a random detail that someone who's not paying attention, right, is going to hold on to. What were some of those strategies that you developed that you've now realized don't work for other people? Can you describe even what your learning style was?
Yeah. So for me, I learned I like things to be orderly, and I felt like I could keep things more orderly if I just did Word documents. And I would just create it as a question. What are the 7 Grand Crus of Chablis, right? That's where I would start, for example. But then I would realize that I was struggling to learn it. And I was like, you know what? If I always say it in the same order, I started naturally just remembering it in a specific order. And I said, you know what? The order is important. So I kind of looked at each region and decided what was the best way to list the information, made that commitment, and then always said it back to myself, always answered it in that order. And it almost became like a sentence where if I got stuck on something, I would just say the beginning part of the sentence faster and it would come out. And I go, oh, there's the word, Boubro or Blanchot or Leclos, whatever it was, So yeah, that I just created systems that made sense to me. And then I would also reorganize the order because it was a Word document I could copy and paste. So the hardest questions, the ones I was struggling with, I would just put at the top of the page. And all I would do is just cover the answer and work my way down the page. And so maybe I didn't get through the entire page, but I got through the ones that were more challenging because I reviewed those often because they were at the top of the page. So I just created my own systems, if that makes sense, that made sense for me.
Yeah. And you've mentioned that these systems, you found other people don't learn that way, or when you go to maybe train your staff or you go to explain something, the system that worked for you doesn't really translate. What kinds of reactions do you get when you try to teach the way that you learned?
A lot of times people just look at the amount of information that I cataloged, and I think it's just overwhelming. They're like, there's no way I'm going to do that. Like, if I just show them France, they're like, are you kidding me? Like, it's just a lot of information. But it's not like it happened overnight. I would go through periods of research and periods of study. And I also realized that it was in the research that I did most of my learning. So there are resources out there. Now the Court of Master Sommeliers started an organization called the Guild of Sommeliers, and there's so much information on there, and it's so reliable. I didn't have that tool, but I often wonder if having all that information at my disposal and being there that easily would have been beneficial for me, because I recognized how so much of the learning, at least for me, was during the process of trying to get an answer that I was confident in putting in my notes. And sometimes there would be conflicting information. Jancis Robinson says this, Hugh Johnson says that. What is it? Well, you never forget once you settle on that answer, right? Like you really thought about that answer so much that it's there, whereas if I'm just reading it off of a website, it's like in and out of my brain. It's not as important to me. So
the story that Dennis tells us sheds light on this controversy that I think exists in lots of high performance domains. Many people ask, does confidence come first and then competence? Or is there something about competence that leads to confidence. It's often an underrated perspective, and one that I hold, that establishing mastery and competence is what actually shapes that deep sense of confidence. It's broader and deeper than I just won my last tennis match. It's the thing that we actually go back to and rely on internally when we're actually not even experiencing success, but even in the face of failure. And there was something about Dennis's early struggles with competence that led him to continue to question his own confidence as well as his capacity to be a high performer. It seems that with his growing confidence, he started to question, do I keep fulfilling someone else's vision, or do I start to pursue my own? Can you tell us about the moment that you knew that you needed to do your own thing?
Yeah, so I had been there probably going on 10 years at this time, might have been 8, 9 years. And Chef Keller said to me, I want to put the wine list on an iPad. Had told me before, like, when I ask you a question, I don't want you just to tell me what you think I want to hear. I'm asking you, for your honest opinion. I want you to share your expertise, so to speak. And so I thought about it, and I didn't articulate myself well at all. I said, I think it's a terrible idea. He goes, why is it a terrible idea? And I said, I don't think it's French Laundry. And he said, I'm French Laundry.
Keller's 3 words, I'm French Laundry. That's the episode right there. Not arrogant, authorship, ownership. And everyone is there to execute his vision. And Dennis sees his options very clearly. Execute Keller's vision, execute someone else's vision, or go out there and execute his own. For a man who'd spent his life fitting himself into other people's rooms, Dennis, for the first time, starts to think about, what's my room?
And the point was, like, my vision for the French Laundry is what you're all here to execute. And I realized as I thought about that moment, as I reflected on it, I could stay there and execute his vision. I could go somewhere else and execute someone else's vision, or I could put my vision on paper and start my own restaurant. And so that was really when I started thinking, it's time. I always knew that would be the end goal, but I got comfortable at the French Laundry. I was really enjoying it. It was I had access to the world's great wines. I had an incredible budget, and I really enjoyed the position. It was a really challenging position to give up. And it was rewarding, Matt Stamp passed his MS exam on my team, Desi Eshabari. So I was building this really great team, and it was very rewarding to see the people that I hired succeed and go on to bigger and better things. And so I could have stayed there happily, but that made me realize that, hey, you have a vision and you owe it to yourself to, put it out there and see if you can make success of it. Otherwise, I would have regrets. I'd look back and go, I shoulda, woulda, coulda. So this way, it was risky, but I felt like it's time, and I had confidence in my ability to make it happen.
Is there anything else in your life that you've done with that level of immersion?
Not really. I mean, I still say the hardest thing I ever did in my life was funding Protege. That was that. Like, if you said to me, okay, you can start the process of learning wine again, or you can
start a restaurant,
start funding Protege. I think maybe that's because I had a lot more fun studying wine, one of the most rewarding parts of that journey for me was just the friendships that I built. I was in a tasting group, and it's kind of where we came up with the name Protege, is that, I've had so many great mentors throughout my career, and the name Protege is an homage to our mentors. But, just being in a tasting group with the same people every week, and the way we challenged each other and we held each other accountable, and we watched each other grow into these great positions throughout the industry. So I really enjoyed the process of learning wine. Certainly examinations and the pressure of preparing for an examination was challenging and stressful, but I enjoyed that. The process of raising funds for Protege was extremely nerve-wracking and stressful. And I, thought about it constantly, and I had to, there were times where I just almost gave up. I was like, I just can't do it. And I was feeling desperation.
Can you take us through what was really challenging there and how that weighed on you, that you would never want to do it again?
I had never asked anybody for money in my life, and I found what I felt was the right space, and it's the space we're in now. And the landlord said to me, "Do you have $1 million in escrow?" And I said, "We haven't even started raising funds." And so the pressure was on at that point. I talked to some advisors who said, just get 4 key investors to invest $250,000. And, so you really only have to sell 4 units, and, that'll get you started, and then you can break it down into smaller increments later. And so that's the way I initially set out to fund it. And, getting someone to commit $250,000 to a restaurant is, well, for me, it was impossible. And I had heard countless times, the statistics. Do you realize 80% of all restaurants go out of business in the first year? And then 80% of the restaurants who make it through the first year go out the second year. And I'm like, yes, I've heard. And so, tooled the PPE and started asking for $50,000. And fortunately, met some of the right people, specifically Allison Rose, who was really gracious about introducing us to friends, and even helped us put together a reception in her own home where she invited 50 of her friends to come, and chef prepared the food and I poured wines to match. And we did a little bit of reception, almost saying like a pairing in a tasting format. Nearly funded the restaurant through that dinner, but it took months until we actually met Allison. And during that point, during that stretch, there was a lot of pressure from the landlord, to hurry up and close the investment. And there were points where I was very desperate and honestly just felt like I would never get this thing funded. So I had gone through the process of writing the business plan, found the perfect partner. We thought we had the concept that would be successful, but we just weren't going to be able to make ends meet and really get the.
The time period was so stressful that it's a bit of a blur that you don't
really
I honestly
even don't know how long.
You don't even know how long it took. Yeah,
I honestly don't. I was so stressed and so focused, and I remember just making a trip home to see my family and being on the phone with my uncle, and I was desperate. I was like, "Do you have any advice you could give me? Like, I just feel like I'm at my wit's end. We've lost momentum, and I just don't know where. I need some new ideas because what I'm doing now is not working. We're not going to get there at this rate. Something has to change." And for us, we still call Allison our angel because she was the person that just magically appeared in our lives. I was actually going to pitch someone else, and they called me, that day, and they're like, "Hey, I got a friend who, I don't really know too much about restaurants. She's really into it. She's actually invested in restaurants before. Do you mind if she comes with me? She's curious." And I was like, "Sure." Little did I know how important that meeting would be.
You clearly, were on your knees in a way, didn't really know what else to do, where else to turn. You did find your guardian angel. So it also takes people believing in you. Like, you believed in yourself. You knew what you needed to do, and you assembled the right credentials. You had the right experience, but then you needed people to believe in you. And Allison was one of those catalysts.
Absolutely. But it was really like starting over because I didn't know anything about writing a business plan. Started my wine journey with Wine for Dummies. So I bought business plans for dummies. And that gave me sort of an outline. And then I went to something called SCORE, It's like Service Corps of Retired Executives. And I made an appointment through the Napa Chamber of Commerce, and I brought my feeble little business plan to them. And they looked at it and they kind of chuckled. And he said, "Well, you have like no financials at all." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't really know where to go. I mean, I have the outline here. I know I need to complete them, but I don't know how to fill in the blanks." And so he started advising me on that. I started going back to him. He was very, very gracious with his time. And eventually, he said, "Okay, you need to start working on your pitch." And I thought, like, how am I going to pitch these wealthy, successful, business people? And so what I started doing was just bringing it to people I knew and trusted and saying, "Hey, here's my business plan, shoot some holes in it," just so I could respond to their objections. And then I would patch those holes. And then I got to the point where people would read it and they'd be like, "Damn, like, it's really solid." Like, and I felt like I had overcome so many of the objections before I actually put it in front of somebody who was potentially an investor. And it just helped prepare me. But again, I felt like I was starting over because it was a completely new process to me, something I was not familiar with. But I did have the confidence, through the success of, earning the Master Sommelier diploma. I was very confident in my business partner, which was, I think, the most important decision that I made. I was very fortunate to make the right, to choose the right person and to convince Chef Anthony, to be a equal partner in this business, which was the key. And he had actually, I identified him very early on in my tenure at the French Laundry. But he moved away. He took a position as the chef de cuisine at the Addison of the Grand Del Mar Resort in San Diego. So his wife, Brianna, was pregnant with their first of now 3 children, Bryce. And so they were moving to San Diego because his mom is there and Brianna's entire family's there. And so I was like, oh no, I was so confident that this was my guy. And all of a sudden he's moving to San Diego, and gave them a 4-year commitment. I started looking at other people thinking, okay, I've got to find another chef. And I just could not find somebody I was entirely confident in. And lo and behold, 4 years later, I still hadn't found a chef. And I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, I know you gave a 4-year commitment. What are you going to do?" And he said, "I'm still thinking about opening a restaurant. You want to come take a look?" And I was like, "Yeah." And so when I told my wife I was going to San Diego to look, around, she goes, "We're not moving to San Diego." And I said, I gotta just see how this works out. After a couple of days of looking around, he says to me, "So what do you think?" And I said, "I think you're going to be making fish tacos and I'm going to be serving beer." I said, it's a great town, but it's just so casual. Everyone's going out in shorts and flip flops. If we're going to have a fine dining component, I think we need to go somewhere less casual. And he said, "What do you have in mind?" And I said, "I think Palo Alto needs an upscale neighborhood restaurant." And obviously it's a very affluent area, but there were some notable failures in the 90s. Jeremiah Trower opened a second Stars location, along with Danko in the mid 90s. He was the most popular restaurant in San Francisco. So it was a big deal that he was opening a second location in Palo Alto. And in 2 years, he was out of business. And then Wolfgang Puck opened Espago in the same space. And I mean, he's been crushing it in Beverly Hills since 1982. And less than a decade later, he shuttered in Palo Alto. So I think most people thought if Jeremiah Trower and Wolfgang Puck can't be successful, it's just an area where they're not going to support ambitious dining. And so restaurateurs really stayed away, and the dining scene was very, very underwhelming. And so we just felt like things were changing. There's a little more new money. You had a lot of these new companies. So a lot of the older money, they stay home. They have help. They have these beautiful homes with these beautiful kitchens, and they like to cook, or they have help, or both. And so they really don't go out. We still see a lot of that. But, now there is younger people here, and they tend to want to go out more. And
And it was the right place. Listening to this story about Dennis, I continue to be impressed by this cumulative mastery, establishing himself in hospitality, establishing himself in Napa, at the French Laundry, the right-hand man of Thomas Keller. And it seems as if when Dennis reaches a point of mastery, he continues to discover a new place where he feels insecure or anxious about needing the support of others. He tells us about the struggle as well as the deep doubt and that phone call to his uncle about whether or not he was going to be able to raise the funds to get his restaurant off the ground. So even though someone can establish that level of mastery and the confidence that goes along with it, that developmental question of whether or not he was ever really good enough. When I reached out to him, even for this podcast, he said, "I'm not sure I'm the person for you. I'm not a high performer." And that's after establishing a Michelin-starred restaurant with tons of support. And he still questions whether or not he's good enough. There was still more I wanted to understand about Dennis. What drives him, how that drive impacts how he leads, and where the tension lives for him now. What makes you tick?
I think curiosity. I think I'm just I'm curious and I'm high energy. I think I'm a momentum guy, so I just keep moving forward. If I sit, I fall asleep. But I think it's really my curiosity that has been my superpower.
That's cool. You're from Cleveland, so you might not like this question, but
okay.
Who have you ticked off along the way?
I'm sure that, I hope not. I do try to treat people respectfully. And I always tell people when I interview them that, you know what, this is an intense restaurant because we have very high internal standards. But I feel like it's a very respectful restaurant because both Chef Anthony and I love our team and we treat them respectfully. And I think people understand that although we can be unrelenting sometimes and we can be very direct, we really just want to communicate expectations. We want to do it in a respectful way. And we feel like that's important. But I think people know that we're coming from a good place. We have good intentions. This restaurant is a reflection of us, but it's also a reflection of them. And I want them, much like I did with the French Laundry, to leave with their standards. I want them to leave with our standards. My sock drawer is a lot tidier after spending 11 years at the French Laundry than it was before I started. I can assure you of that. It really changed my standards of everything. And that applies to everything. And I want our team to take away our standards when they leave. But I think they understand that, we have to have certain expectations in order to operate at the level that we want to operate at.
So Dennis is a great example of the dark horse, and let me underscore a few things here about that. He bumped into what he was good at. That early training that we all get, take the SATs, go to a good college, get a great job, get on that path of success. The dark horse tends to use curiosity, find fulfillment, and then excellence and mastery comes from there. It's not a learned path. It's one that almost just happens to you. And Dennis is a great example of that. I think one of the takeaways here is that the pathway to high performance looks quite different. I've chatted with parents at times who feel concerned about that non-traditional learner, the one that doesn't do well at math, that might even want to drop out of high school. And I think Dennis and other dark horses are an inspiration that sticking with something that you're good at or that you find curiosity and fulfillment in can absolutely lead to a path of high performance. If today's conversation resonated with you, follow the show for more conversations about what lives beneath high performance. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and share your comments below. I'm Dr. Sharon Chirban. Thanks for listening closely.